Welcome to this edition of Great Books, a lively discussion of a selection from the canon of exceptional literature. Here's your host, Jack Hatfield.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us for the Great Book Show. I'm Jack Hatfield. Our panel meets periodically to discuss great works of classic and modern literature. Dave will introduce our selection for today, the short story Cathedral by Raymond Carver. Dave?
Today's selection is the short story Cathedral by the American writer and poet Raymond Carver. Born in 1938, Carver grew up in the working class lumber culture of the Pacific Northwest. In the early 60s, Carver began to publish stories here and there in little literary magazines. His breakthrough to greater attention came when he was 38, with the publication in 1976 of Will You Please Be Quiet, Please, a collection of short stories. Carver's stories often contain a minimalist, flat affect picture of sad or depressed or alcoholic people in tough situations. A committed and chaotic alcoholic himself, alcohol is often a character in his stories. Carver quit drinking in 1977, the beginning of a halcyon period with awards, endowments, recognition, and the publication of What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, Cathedral, Where I'm Calling From, and publication in The New Yorker, Esquire, and The Atlantic. Carver died of cancer in 1988 at the age of 50. Cathedral, the title story in the collection of the same name, was written in 1981. The story begins with the first-person narrator grousing about his ambivalence about a coming house guest, a blind male friend of his wife's who haven't seen each other in 10 years. They kept in touch, though, sending tape-recorded messages and news about their lives. The narrator describes Robert, the blind man, and an evening of drinking, gluttonous eating, and more drinking. When his wife goes to bed, the narrator and Robert are alone. After a period of strained conversation, the narrator flips on the TV and settles on a show about cathedrals. Robert asks the narrator for a description of what he can't see. The narrator tries, but feels unsuccessful. "That's okay," Robert says. "We'll draw one together." What bothers the narrator about Robert? Why does Robert call the narrator Bub? How will the blind man benefit from the narrator's drawing? Why does the narrator or the author call attention to Robert's beard? Please join us as we try to understand cathedrals, our narrator, and the picture Carver draws for us.
The title of the story is Cathedral, and what I think is the climax of the story involves drawing a cathedral. Why do you think the author chose Cathedral as opposed to some other building?
Joe?
Now, why would you think? I would think.
We had been watching a television show, and Cathedral was on it, but why would the
Carver could have
author
made
have it
it dogs.
a cathedral? It was interesting that the blind man suggested he draw a cathedral only after the blind man asked him whether he was a religious person or not. And only after the husband said, cathedrals mean absolutely nothing to me.
Right.
After that, the blind man decided to do cathedrals. And I thought cathedrals have that religious element in it. And also, they always seem to me as places of light, which are opposed to the darkness of a blind man. And we're talking about somebody who's absolutely blind to a lot of things in life. And I thought that through the cathedral, maybe it opened up his life and he saw a different dimension, which is also in the religion.
Opened up whose life? The blind man?
No, the husband.
The husband.
narrator.
The husband, the
unnamed
narrator.
The unnamed
The unnamed
narrator.
narrator.
It's interesting it was unnamed.
I would agree with that. I'd add majestic.
Majestic, good
Yeah,
word.
His life was kind of dull and he didn't believe in anything, and all of a sudden he was trying to imagine this majestic, reaching to the heavens sort of building, and then.
And I think the blind man wanted him to do that. right?
Well,
Or
he
wanted
tried
because
by
it was a
himself
cathedral.
to explain it, and he was dissatisfied with how he was explaining it. He couldn't capture it in words to satisfy.
Oh, he was practically.
Well, he
was
kept
practically.
apologizing.
He kept
apologizing
apologizing,
for
and
his
so the
description.
blind man interceded and said, I'm going to teach you the way, the tactile way that I experience things, and then maybe you can get the feeling of awe and majesty.
I
You
also
know, I
thought.
found it interesting why he asked that question about cathedrals. Because if someone's blind, you ask that question about everything. The train that you took in, how did you imagine the train? Why did he ask that question about cathedrals?
I'm saying it's because he asked that question immediately after asking him about whether
His
he
own
believed in
religion.
anything about his religion.
Or what he believed in. I thought, when I read your question, I thought, I was thinking about it, and I thought that one of the things that the blind man said was, it wasn't even so much it was the building, of course, but it was also the faith of the people who built the building. What he said was, a cathedral is something that you start and you don't have any hope of seeing the end of it, like life.
Right.
He said, you don't know what the end is going to be, like life. So I also thought that it was a way of expanding this man, the narrator is fairly contained, fairly limited in his way of thinking. And this was a way of opening something up to something that, for example, the Washington Monument would not suffice in that way, because, you build it in 20 years or whatever it is, and then you go on to the next thing. This was people putting their lives, their souls, and a sense to connect to something larger than themselves that they never would hope to see the end of. And I thought that was.
Even at the end of drawing it, the blind man said, now put some people in it. So it wasn't just the cathedral that he was interested in, the building. He was making a point to the narrator.
He was helping broaden his perspective.
Exactly.
Because he was so flat about everything, about his wife, about his situation, about his drinking. Nothing made a difference. Everything was just there.
The narrator, you're talking about
Yeah,
the narrator.
yeah.
Could you substitute limited and all those words for, could you substitute blind in a way?
Yes.
The
Yeah.
narrator was
Yeah.
blind also in a way.
In his own way. Yeah.
And I thought the narrator was very sad in the way his life was described. His wife said he had no friends,
Right?
And what did he do every night? His wife went to bed and he smoked pot, and then he waited till he fell asleep, and then he had bad dreams that he would wake up from with his heart beating very quickly. Okay, it seems.
That
And he
sounds
didn't like
great.
his job. I mean, they described a very limited
Yeah.
life.
He wasn't a happy man.
He was not a happy man at all.
So then what happened? I mean, did the blind man ask him to draw the cathedral, and the blind man put his hand over as he moved, and then something happened to the narrator. What do you think happened to him? Does anyone want to read
Something happened to.
the narrator? Does anyone want to go to that?
Are you talking about the very end?
Yeah.
Very end.
So we kept on with it. His fingers rode my fingers as my hand went over the paper.
Right.
It was like nothing else in my life up to now. Then he said, I think that's it. I think you've got it, he said. Take a look. What do you think? But I had my eyes closed. I thought I'd keep them that way for a little longer. I thought it was something I ought to do. Well, he said, are you looking? My eyes were still closed. I was in my house. I knew that. But I didn't feel like I was inside anything. It's really something, I said.
What
I
happened?
really like that. Obviously, his eyes was open. He was no longer blind to what the blind man was trying to show him about life. I thought that was a very strong ending in that he was outside of himself for once, and he wasn't locked inside his blindness to life.
Another way might be the difference between just seeing something and to really understand it, because he wanted to keep his eyes closed. Because he was sensing it with his eyes closed, which was very different than before, where he could look at the TV and see a picture of the cathedral, and see a picture of his wife, and see a picture of.
But I also think that one of the ways you really see something is by drawing it. And so even not just feeling it after he drew it, but doing the drawing was a way of actually seeing the cathedral in all its glory.
I think the tactile sense comes in a couple of places. The beard, it appears to me, is prominent, and he fiddles with it, the blind man does, because it gives him a sense of touch that is almost as good as seeing. That's how I read it. I don't know if
The touching of the beard, the
Yeah.
comments about touching the beard.
Yeah. And he touched her face, the wife's face, when
Right.
they were younger, to know her. And so the idea of touch as something that can awaken you, even if you can't see.
That was in
and
the
it's-
husband's mind quite a bit, by the way.
Yes.
I thought.
Yes,
the
I thought so
touching
too. The touching of
his
the
wife's face.
Because in some ways that was the most intimate thing
very
that
intimate.
happened. And similarly, as he was touching his hand, that was very intimate too. The other thing was that I got the sense, and this was never stated. In fact, he said the narrator
He's good
says,
at not stating things.
Yes, he said I took up the pen again, and he found my hand. I kept at. I'm no artist, but I kept drawing just the same. As they were describing what he was drawing, it seemed to me that it was becoming more artistic. It was becoming more elaborate. He's drawing the gargoyles. He's drawing buttresses. He's drawing people inside. He's deciding what it is he wants to draw, and he keeps adding to the drawing. The blind man doesn't tell him what to draw. He just keeps adding and adding to the drawing. I got the sense, and this is the part that wasn't stated, that in some ways he was discovering a mode of expression, an artistic mode of expression that he didn't have before, and he still didn't have at the end when after this very profound experience. What does he say? It's really something.
He couldn't put it
He
in
couldn't
words.
put it into words. He wasn't good with words. It's really something, I said.
You know, when you look at the characters in the story, I think the blind man was the happiest guy of all of them.
You certainly got
And
that
the
sense.
wife seemed lonely. The husband, I think, was angry at the
nothing.
wife with this relationship that sending tapes once a year. In fact,
The snarky comments he kept
wasn't
making.
there one phrase in there where the husband is asked, no, the blind man says that his wife on one of the tapes, based on what you've told me about him, I've concluded, and then it stops.
Yeah.
And it stops.
You remember
Yes,
it stops?
yes.
Yeah.
I've concluded. Now, what's the ending of that sentence?
And then he turned it off.
Yeah, well, I think
It
he's
stopped
very
his-
angry because of the relationship she had with the blind man, and especially the touching of the face, okay? Because none of the other characters are. This guy, the blind man, had a pretty good relationship when he was married with
Blind
his
man's
wife.
Sounds
got it
like
a
it.
together.
loving
Yes,
relationship.
yeah.
I never got the feeling of a loving relationship between the narrator.
at all.
Pardon me?
Not at all.
Not
I
at
think he
all.
was attached to his wife, the narrator.
Yes.
He kept, but intimate, no. I mean,
No.
there was no close.
That's
she
a
was
good
more.
word,
She was
intimate,
intimate. Yeah, she was more intimate with the blind man.
Yeah.
There's two other examples where I thought he was blind too, and one of them, he says he didn't like art. He didn't like poems. He didn't like
Right,
poetry.
it's not what he's
So-
going to pick
I
up.
wanted to read the
But-
poem that the wife wrote. It wasn't in the
Yeah.
story, you know.
But-
Yeah, right.
But there's something else when the wife was explaining about the blind man's relation to his wife, Beulah, that that they were very close and all this, and then the narrator couldn't understand that because he couldn't see. He said, if you can't see somebody, how can you possibly have a good relationship with them? And that was just kind of a
Blindness.
real
blindness.
blindness to
And- and his
that really
fantasy.
the real
struck me
surface,
also.
the
And
real
this-
surfacey sort
Absolutely,
of
yeah.
approach to life.
And his fantasy about what the wife was thinking at the end of her life, that I've lived my whole life with this man, I've never been able to
I've
see-"
never
Yeah, right.
Yes,
Yeah.
as if that were what she would be thinking
Yeah.
at the
Okay,
end of
the line that struck me was, imagine a woman who could never see herself as she was seen in the eyes of her loved one. A woman who could go on day after day and never receive the smallest compliment from her beloved. How blind was the narrator? You don't need to see someone to compliment someone. You don't need to see someone visually to know what kind of person they are. I mean, he was so superficial.
He was anchored in what he could
And
see.
he didn't even realize he was so superficial.
Yes.
What do you make of the? I thought when you said I thought I would keep my eyes closed. I had my eyes closed. I thought I'd keep them that way for longer. I thought it was something I ought to do. What's that sense of obligation? And what's that sense of rightness or
He's going to try it. He's going to try to branch out.
I thought he was getting a vision. I can't find the words. The blind man was able to, I think, to see through life, get below the surfacey, and so the narrator had a moment of that he wanted to continue, and he could continue that with his eyes closed. All of a sudden, he could visualize something beneath the surface.
Well, was any of this helped by the fact that they had been just smoking pot?
and drinking? I thought,
Drinking.
yes,
Yeah,
I
they
think
did
it
a
was
lot of
yes.
You know, so
Yes.
that could have helped him come to this realization. But what
I,
got me,
I started counting the drinks. Yeah, they did.
Yeah, lots.
They were a lot.
Yeah.
And they were heavy ones.
And they were heavy ones,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
They were
This much water. In the,
this
Yes,
much
yeah,
water in
yeah,
a
yeah.
full glass.
but I was confused as to how the blind man could see or feel the drawing until I realized they asked for very heavy paper, and then he said to press really hard so
You could feel the
that it was
lines.
a tactile
Yeah,
okay.
right.
experience.
Okay. Okay.
You know, because I looked, I said, how could this be? You know, he's still blind. How could he look at a drawing?
Right, right.
And
well,
then I realized he
half
must
of
have been really
it, half of
pressing
it could
into it.
be feeling the narrator's hand also, because if he's pressing hard, you'll get more of the feeling of the emotion instead of some wispy little.
Yeah, but then
pencil
you'd
point.
have to remember where the guy's hand went in order to put the
Oh, I
picture
don't
together.
think I don't think
But
the
I think
blind
if he
man was
pressed the
interested
things-
in what the cathedral looked like at all.
all.
He was doing this as a service to the narrator.
Oh, you think so?
Interesting.
I think so.
I could
Possible.
see that. I could see that.
Well, he asked him, what does the cathedral look like? So I'm not sure what you're saying is.
Well, he, based on this tactile fixation I have with the beard and such, and the touching of the face, the touching of the hand is another example of that. And he was trying to get to that if it couldn't be put into words because this guy's vocabulary or imagination wasn't well developed enough, that he would have him feel the drawing of it.
Okay.
What, this might not have any meaning for anybody else, but what caught me was the wife had a suicide attempt that wasn't
Yes.
successful.
Right.
And she was saying she was cut off from people. Then they went for a year, she and the blind man communicating by tape, which seems to be a kind of a very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not a person-to-person sort of thing. It's very
Off-putting.
cold in a sense.
It's interesting. It's
It's
interesting
just
you say
a
that.
level
Because I used to.
removed.
Has anybody ever tried doing that with with friends? I had a girlfriend once when I was in college who was Canadian, and she was a year ahead of me, so she graduated before I did. Went up to Canada, and that's how we we communicated, was by taping. It's interesting. It's a strange combination of intimacy and distance.
Yeah.
When you start hearing the other person's voice and the inflections, you begin to have the fantasy that you're with them, and yet you're always aware of that distance.
Yeah, you couldn't
There
write
was
a letter, right?
Because he couldn't read it.
Yeah. So that was a logical thing to keep up a social life. I didn't think it was so bizarre.
Distance
kind of
was the word I
ingenious.
was looking for.
The distance,
There was
yeah.
a distance.
There's a distance,
that she
yes.
always had this distance relationship.
Yes.
What did you get out of that next to the last line? My eyes were still closed. I was in my house. I knew, but I didn't feel like I was inside anything. What's the interpretation of that? I didn't feel like I was inside anything.
He had busted loose of his limitations.
He was outside the barriers that he had imposed on himself.
Yeah.
And keeping his eyes closed would be
He could see
help
more with his eyes closed.
with his eyes closed, and that wouldn't and he'd be able to actually continue that feeling. When you open your eyes, you see the walls. It sort of ends.
Okay.
That's how I interpreted it.
Yeah, but back to the tape that the wife kept sending, it was described as something she needed to do from herself. It was sort of like a
Yes.
diary, that she was sending these tapes and she was writing poems, and those were the two ways she was expressing herself. Neither of which involved the husband at all.
Right.
So there's very little expression between them, and she's expressing herself through her poetry, which her husband doesn't read, and the tapes to the blind man.
she's not real wild about him either. He makes the point that he's waiting for her or Robert to say, "How did you meet your wonderful husband?" And nothing like this transpires.
She was really snarky the whole time.
Yeah.
I thought that's.
Well, I think she detected his jealousy, and I think that she was defensive. She got quite defensive about it. When she comes out of the car, it's the only time you see her happy in the whole thing until they start eating and then getting drunker and later on, because as they come out, she's got his arm and then she's smiling, and he says something about, "How about that?" The husband says something along those lines.
And the husband doesn't understand why she's smiling and is happy with this blind man, because he's so prejudiced against the blind man for being blind.
So who's the blind man?
Yeah.
You know, that's the question.
I wonder if the wife could have really formed a relationship with anybody ever, including the blind man, if he was right in front of her. And I got the impression she couldn't. That's just a guess, but she.
That reminds me of the blind man calling him Bub, because to me that means that he could be anybody and she could be anybody. That he didn't call him by his name, and just like some Joe you meet on the street, right, Bub? And that's the way he talked. He was like a messenger.
What was the husband's name?
What was what?
No one knows. It was just-
No one
No one
knows.
knows.
There's
one
no
knows.
name.
There's no name.
Never.
Aside from Bob.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I don't see it. But
I saw Bub as almost more of a casual intimacy.
Halsey-walsey.
Yeah,
It
yes,
is.
a casual intimacy. That's kind of how I,
Yeah.
an easygoing and relaxed kind of intimacy.
Because the blind man had lots of friends through the ham radio. He had friends all over the world, right?
Right.
And so he could relate to other guys. And I thought it was just a friendly Bub, just like you did.
Okay.
The author didn't give him any identity, the husband, because of the lack of name. That's interesting.
Do we know what he did for a
Throughout the
living?
whole story.
We don't
Something
know
he
anything.
didn't like.
Definitely he didn't
right?
like it,
Because
yes.
he said he didn't like his job.
Right.
But the author gives us a lot of insight into his character. I mean, that's what the
Big
story's
yes.
about. So, yeah. So, what's your final impression of this?
I thought it was a good story, but it was a very ordinary story. It's a story about very ordinary people. There's no big
Drama.
moral here, I don't think.
No drama.
Not much drama, just very everyday stuff. A visit from a blind man, a friend.
But I disagree. I think there was a lot of symbolism there in who was the blind man and what did the cathedral mean, and how you really see people on a superficial level or deeper. And so I thought it was a good story about normal life that had meaning hidden underneath it.
Yeah, that's what I'd say.
I was impressed by the economy of it.
Yes.
The economy of the story was wonderful.
More terse than Hemingway.
What's that?
More terse than Hemingway.
Yeah, short sentences and just.
Yes.
Yeah.
And his opening sentence is wonderful, I think. The blind man, an old friend of my wife's, he was on his way to spend the night. I mean, there's something about that absolutely grabs you, and it's so colloquial and yet and terse, but it.
Good point.
But you could tell he really thought about each word. Because
Yes.
there's a part
Yes.
where the blind man comes and the wife says, "It's so good to see you." Now, well, you know how you say that
I
whole line
that,
is. Not,
yeah.
It's so good to have you here.
Right.
It's so good to see you. And I said, oh, he thought about that line. He
Yes.
really thought about it.
I wonder if he writes and then he cuts things out. I wonder if he and Hemingway were just
Well,
had a pencil.
his editor did that famously.
What's that?
His editor did that famously. Not the time to discuss it, but in short,
Yeah, you said that.
his editor, Gordon Lish, slashed his stories, some of his most famous stories for publication, even by
really?
half
Really?
in some cases. And he
While
claims
he was
that he's the
alive?
great Svengali behind Carver.
interesting.
And then some of the originals were published later, and they're pretty good.
So was he alive? Was Carver alive
Yeah.
when he did all this?
Oh, it was
Any-
bad blood.
Oh, it was bad blood.
between them.
I didn't realize editors had that kind of power, that they could publish something.
He was super editor.
They said something in here about some of these stories. This is Where I'm Calling From, which is one of the ones you mentioned. So some of these stories were revised for publication in this book.
And lengthened.
And lengthened?
Yes.
Oh, interesting.
Some details were added that he couldn't live without.
It says, editors note the stories in this collection are arranged chronologically. A number of them have been revised for this edition, and in a few cases, titles have been changed.
You didn't give your opinion of the story.
Oh, I liked it.
Yeah, but
I recommended it.
I know. But
No, I'm a big Carver fan, and I love the minimalism of it and the starkness of it, and the juice that he gets out of that. Those short sentences, it's kind of off-putting, and the people are down on their luck and invariably depressed or drunk, but it's a nice little package. Each of his little stories.
It's interesting, the despair, the grayness, the dullness, and yet this had a relatively hopeful ending. I mean, this was not that kind of a.
I think the strength was that, like Bob was saying, just the opposite. He was saying it's just an ordinary story. I think that's kind of the strength of it.
The strength of it, yeah.
Yeah, is having that underlying strength that's built on this very ordinary story.
Yeah.
So
Or it's a story about ordinary life.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned, Maureen, about the symbolism. What do you think, or what does everybody think about the cathedral as a symbol? I mean, we sort of discussed what its function was in the story, but is there a symbolic significance to
I think we discussed that. It was we used the words majestic and
Majesty and giving light. The cathedral is a source of light. When you're
Okay.
telling a story about a man who is blind and who has many limitations, and the cathedral gets you outside of that, if you're a faith believer, right? And so therefore it's a symbol of that.
I read someplace that cathedrals were built so high because the closer people were trying to get closer to heaven.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's why you'd go to a small village and they would have this massive cathedral because everybody wanted to get to heaven.
That was also a prestige symbol for a different village who was the tallest cathedral.
Yeah.
So
Makes sense.
first time I read it, I said, what can we talk about? Because it was so ordinary. And then I go, whoa, this is really done by a master.
Yes,
Yeah.
I agree.
It was cool.
Yeah.
He made a very good description of a limited man, and the man who was limited was not the blind man.
Right. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the show. Join us next time as we discuss another great selection. As Aristotle said, the best way to learn is to get together in small groups and discuss great ideas.